From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Brian Floca is an author and illustrator of children's books. His most recent work is Locomotive, a tale set in 1869 of a family, a mother, son, and daughter, on a journey from Omaha to Sacramento aboard the newly completed Transcontinental Railroad. Other transportation books he has written and illustrated include Moonshot, The Flight of Apollo 11, published in 2009, Lightship, published in 2007, and the Racecar Alphabet, published in 2003. Mr. Floca was born and raised in Temple, Texas, graduated from Brown University, receiving the MFA from the School of Visual Arts, where he also taught undergraduate and continuing education courses. He currently lives and works in Brooklyn, New York. Other titles he has illustrated include many award winners, City of Light, City of Dark, and the Poppy Stories series by Avi, Ballet for Martha, Making Appalachian Spring by Jan Greenberg and Sandra Jordan, The Hinky Pink by Megan McDonald, Marty McGuire Digs Worms and Marty McGuire Has Too Many Pets, both by Kate Messner. Awards include the Robert F. Sibert Honor Award, the Society of Illustrators Silver Medal, the Orbis Pictus Award, the New York Times Best Illustrated Children's Book List, Kirkus Review's Editor's Choice, and the American Library Association Notable Children's Book Award. Mr. Floca will be signing books today, not tomorrow, today, between 1 and 2 p.m. The pavilion is near 14th Street at 7th, it's 14th. Please welcome me and please welcome Mr. Brian Floca.
Thank you. It's great to be here on the Mall as part of the National Book Festival. I'm going to talk to you today about making my new book, Locomotive. I'm going to share with you some of the big things that went into the book and some of the small things. Locomotive is the story of a family that travels west, not east, on the Transcontinental Railroad the summer after it's completed. It's the story of the crews that make the engine go and the landscape through which they travel. Now, I started working on Locomotive while I was finishing my last book, Moonshot, and Moonshot is the story of... Thanks. It's never happened before. Story of the Apollo 11 mission to the moon. It was a project I really loved working on, a book I loved making. It got very complicated by the end. And so I started looking for something that would be a little bit simpler to do next. And I thought back to my hometown of Temple, Texas. Thank you. And here are my parents up from Temple today, embarrassed. So Temple was a railroad town. It doesn't look quite like this today. There are a few more buildings. But there was a big old steam locomotive sitting out in the city park when we were growing up. And we would drive by it every time we went downtown or back from downtown. And so I started doing sketches of a steam locomotive. The Saturn V rocket had been pretty complicated to understand, but a steam locomotive operates basically on boiling water. It's really just a big tea kettle on wheels. So I thought, how hard could it be to make a book about it? So I worked up a lot of drawings of steam locomotives, and then I wanted to make a nonfiction book. I wanted to make a book about true facts, so I had to start reading about steam locomotives. So I started reading about locomotives in the West and visiting museums. This is the Great B&O Railroad Museum in Baltimore. And I started noticing not only the large locomotives that I had initially sketched, but also these smaller engines. And I came to a sort of crossroads in making the book as to whether I wanted to make it about these grand, big engines from about 100 years ago, or these smaller engines from, say, 150 years ago. And I ended up deciding to go with the smaller engines, even though I love the big engines. The smaller engines are the ones that really changed the country. 150 years ago, if you wanted to get from the eastern half of the country over to California, there was no rail line connecting the two parts of the country. You would have to take a covered wagon pulled by oxen. It would take you about 6 months to cross the continent. It was dangerous, it was expensive, it was difficult. When the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, you could take a train from the sort of network of rail in the east to Omaha, Nebraska, and then ride the train over the plains into the mountains, through the desert, mountains again, down to California. And that would take about a week. So suddenly it was possible to cross a continent in a week. Now, all through, ever since the domestication of the horse, the fastest you had been able to travel across land was as fast as an animal could pull you. And now here's this machine that can carry you across the continent in a week. So this is transformative. So out went the locomotives from 100 years ago, and in went the smaller engines from 150 years ago. Now, what this meant was the very simple book I had imagined I was going to make about steam engines was becoming very complicated, because now I was reading not just about how steam engines worked, but about what it was like to travel the Transcontinental Railroad. I read a lot of great primary source accounts. I read a lot. I looked at old pictures, and I really sort of fell in love with the people in these pictures. They dress differently than us. They live in different places than us, but they're people just like us, and they lived extraordinary lives. And they come down to us in these sort of still black and white pictures, but the more you learn about their lives, the more you realize how colorful and vibrant and exciting this time was. And I fell in love with these incredible machines, and the sort of sometimes crazy-looking people who operated them, and the hood ornaments. And one of the great things about making a book and research is when you find something that you love or that interests you, you get to put it in a book and share it with other people. A lot of the pictures I looked at were stereoscopic. So there's a photograph for your left eye and a photograph for your right eye. And if you have the right holder for the image, you can see it in 3D. And I can't show these to you in 3D, but I can sort of toggle between the left and right eye and give you a little sense of how that would work. And these are snow sheds that they built in the Sierra Nevada to keep the snow off the track. This is a guy in the middle of nowhere. This is Promontory Summit. The Transcontinental Line was built by two companies, one built from the east, one built from the west, and they met in the middle in Utah on Promontory Summit. And one more. Now, I wanted to write about driving a steam locomotive, so what's the best possible thing in a perfect world that would help me understand what it's like to drive a steam locomotive? Yes, sir, drive one. So this is a steam locomotive in Essex, Connecticut, that if you, takes people around on sort of dinner trips during the summer, and before the season starts and after the season ends, if you write them a large enough check, they will sit down with you for an hour and talk with you about how a steam locomotive works, and then under close supervision, you will be allowed to drive it. You don't have to have a beard, but it helps. So I did all this research, and then I thought I had basically researched the whole book. I thought a nice final thing to do would be to actually drive the Transcontinental Route that I described to you earlier. I thought this would just be a little grace note to my research, and what this did was then just sort of open the book all up again, because the book ended up becoming about the landscape as well as all of these other things that go into the trip. So I started at the Union Pacific Railroad Museum. This was my favorite sign of the trip. I drove west across Nebraska, and you really see the country changing as you're going west. It's a terrific drive. It gets rougher. It gets rockier. You might meet a prairie dog. And you see these towns that were described by people who traveled the route 150 years ago. Here's Castle Rock in Wyoming, and here it is today. So part of what I get to do is find these things that interest me the most and figure out a way to put them in the book and hope that they will interest you also. This picture will show how closely you can follow the route of the original Transcontinental Line. This is a picture I took while I was driving west, and I'm going to change it to black and white. And now I'm going to swap out this picture and put up a picture from 1869. So keep your eyes on those cliffs in the center of the picture. So where there's a highway today and a railroad, there was just the railroad in 1869. And that tree was called the 1,000-mile tree. It's a big pine tree. And when you saw that tree out your train window, you realized you had traveled 1,000 miles from Omaha, Nebraska. And you can just make out a lot of people standing at the bottom of the tree and also one guy at the top. They really loved to climb things in the 1860s. So next, my drive got me to Promontory Summit. This is where the line was completed, and this becomes the first image in the book. Here's the line being completed in 1869. Now, we're really used to seeing these engines through old black and white pictures, but they were actually very brightly painted, brightly polished, colorful, and they have 2 replica engines at Promontory Summit today, and they both run. And another great thing about being an author and an illustrator is that you can call up people you've never met before and tell them you're working on a book and you're curious about something they know a lot about, and ask them if they will share that with you. And if they're passionate about it, usually they will say yes. So I sent an email to the people at the National Park site on Promontory Summit and ended up getting invited into the cabs of these engines to watch how they were operated. And one runs on coal and one runs on wood. I took a lot of pictures while I was there. I also did a lot of drawing. You will learn more doing one drawing than you will taking 20 pictures. Drawing is just a way of making you actually look at what's in front of you. And so all of these drawings become very important to the images that end up in the book. Further west through Nevada, this is another museum where I got to stop and talk with a curator. This is an old railroad car that's not on public display, but I got to go check it out. It's in pretty bad shape. But what, the author and illustrator's job is, if you've learned enough, you can take something beat up like this and imagine what it was like in its prime, alive and in use. After Nevada, you get to the mountains of California, the Sierra Nevada. This is Donner Lake. This is Summit Tunnel. This is the longest tunnel that was built on the Transcontinental Railroad, which you can walk through today. It's pretty creepy. I have a lot of pictures like this. Out the other end is Sacramento. So, and the end of the line, another great museum, and the old passenger station. So I do all this research, and the whole time I'm writing. And the writing, just because I've done all this research, the writing does not come easily, and I do not just sit down and write out a book. The writing starts off sort of like this, very messy. It's notes, questions, phrases, and writing is really about rewriting and cutting things up and rearranging them, scratching things out. The drawing starts off the same way, very rough sketches, thinking about what do I want in the book, how do I want to show it to you. Also thinking about how all these drawings are going to get along together. It's not like at a museum, you're just going to see one image on its own. You're going to go from image to image. So I'm very interested in the transition from picture to picture. When I have made enough storyboards, I make a book dummy. This allows me to turn the pages of the story and start to experience the story the way you're going to experience it as a reader. This is, and I have nothing against ebooks in particular, but I'm not making an ebook, I'm making a book, a physical book. So you are going to turn the pages. You are going to turn the pages, and the medium is part of the experience. A book is not sort of a neutral vessel for a story. So I am trying to figure out what is going to happen when you get to a certain point in the story and have to turn a page. So I might make a lot of book dummies to try to get this right. I might make too many. People in the audience who could comment on that, but that's for later. And when I make these, I send them to my editor, and then they come back to me with notes and questions. And of course, the one note I hope I'm going to get is, this is perfect, take the afternoon off. Sometimes I get told to take the afternoon off, but never because the book is perfect. But I work with a very talented, smart editor named Dick Jackson, and he helps me sort of see the book freshly and helps me make it better than I could make it on my own by far. So I'm grateful to him. I want to show you the studio and where I actually do the work. We're sort of cutting into my school presentation here, so you get this little special effect. My studio is in New York. I get to share the space with 4 other authors and illustrators. It's a great space. It's in an old sweater factory in Brooklyn. And I share it with Sergio Routsier. I can't see what's panning across the screen now. You'll see me working hard. Sophie Blackall, who illustrates the Ivy and Bean books. Eddie Hemingway, who's absent. Is it not going? Oh. All right, now, oh, there we go. Thanks. So that's where the 5 of us work. It's a great arrangement. We all work on our own projects, but when one of us gets stuck, we're able to complain to the others. When one of us gets hungry, we're able to order lunch together. It's a really healthy and appreciated setup. This is my little corner of it. I keep a lot of my art supplies in an old card catalog cabinet. Oh, yeah. I have a lot of books in the studio. Some of them are research. Some of them are just picture books that I admire and love and that are inspiration to me when I get stuck. I am not a Luddite. I have my computer. It's this computer showing you itself. And here is a picture underway. You can see the book dummy. So I've got figured out the picture that I want to draw, how big I want it to be, where I want it to be in the book. I have reference material. This is that picture of the engine with the antlers on it, so you can see a little deer to the left there. That's I'm borrowing his antlers for the picture. Sometimes I use scale models if there's an angle that I want that I can't get from an actual engine. Sometimes I do the exciting work of modeling myself. This is a picture of me in my apartment with my mop. And let me take you through the stages of one of the drawings in the book. This is the drawing of the Dale Creek Bridge. So this is how it looks in the final book. This is a pretty finished sketch of it. And when I've got the finished sketch, I transfer the drawing. I do the drawing for real on tracing paper, a large sheet of tracing paper. And then I trace that onto heavy watercolor paper in pencil. And then I ink the drawing. This is a nib pen, so there's no ink in the pen. If I want to draw with it, I open up a bottle of ink, and I dip the pen into the ink. And the tricky thing about a pen like this is that it's really good for flicking ink everywhere. But once you've got the hang of it, it lets you make a line with a lot of variation in it. So if you press down with a little more pressure, you get a nice heavy line. If you press down very lightly, you get a nice thin line. And that's something that I really like. So it's the kind of pen I use. So I ink the drawing, and then I tape it to a board. And I tape it down because it's going to get wet. I'm going to paint it with watercolors. So the way the watercolors work, I get the brush wet, I mix the color that I want on the watercolor palette, and then I put that onto the painting. And as the paper gets wet, when you're painting the large sections, it will buckle. But if it's taped down at the edges, it will flatten out again as it dries. So that's the tape. A sort of shorthand for what authors and illustrators do is that we make books. This is kind of true, but it's kind of not true. What we really do is make paintings and write stories and think about how we want those to look in a book. And then our publishers actually make the book for us. So when I finished all the paintings, I take it to my publisher, in this case Simon & Schuster. And the people at Simon & Schuster take what I give them, and then they talk with a printer and talk about how to turn that into a book. This is Elizabeth Blake Lynn. She's a production manager at Simon & Schuster. So she gets in touch with the printer. She says, we have these paintings. We want you to print them on this kind of paper and use this kind of color, and this is how we want them to look. The printer takes a stab at that. They send proofs back to Liz. Liz says, this is pretty good, but this should be more blue. This should be more yellow. Also, the paper's not working. There's a tremendous amount of back and forth. And this is the paper that piled up in the course of that conversation for Locomotive. When everybody has agreed on the best way to make the book is printed. This is actually the printing press in New Jersey that printed a book of mine several years ago called 5 Trucks, but I got to go watch that book being printed. And at the top of each of those towers is ink, paper goes in one end of the press, ink is applied, paper comes out the other end looking not quite like a book, but if you fold it, trim the edges, bind it, there you are. So about 6 months after I turn the art into Simon & Schuster, I get a box that looks like this, and I open it up, and there's my book. And it's a great feeling, and it's also kind of terrifying, because for a year or 2 or 3 or 4, my relationship to this work has been looking for things I can make better about it. And innately, that's still the relationship I want to have with the book. But there's no longer anything I can do about it. This book is done. So it's kind of terrifying to get the finished book. But the good thing about getting the finished book is that now there is all of this stuff that I've been thinking about and trying to make real for other people, and that story has a chance to go out into the world and a chance for you to read it and like it or not like it, but to interact with it, and I do hope enjoy it. And that is the end of time for my slideshow, but I do have time for questions, I think. Thanks.
This is going to be more of a comment. Your book arrived for me to catalog last week, and I took it down to one of my really low reading, reluctant readers, and I handed it to Christopher. And about 2 hours later, the teacher brought it back up to me and says, "Christopher can't read this. It's all in different fonts." At the end of the day, Christopher met me as he was leaving. He said, "Mrs. Hoover, may I please have that book back? It's the best book. I love making the noises."
That's amazing. Thank you. That's great. And that's really great to hear, because this is a long book. You know, it's a 64-page picture book, which is kind of crazy. But to hear that a reluctant reader sort of is engaged by it and wants to thank you very much.
What are you thinking about for your next book?
What am I thinking about for my next book? For the next projects that I'll work on, I have some illustration projects coming up. First, thank you for the question. You know, I worked on this project for so long, and I was so exhausted by the end of it that I've spent a little bit of time not thinking about what I'm going to do next. I know. But now I'm starting to think about it, and it's very fuzzy in my head, but a couple of things are starting to come into focus. I'm not sure which one will really sharpen up, though. Thank you.
You're welcome.
My question kind of relates to the first comment, and that is that in this book, font played a strong role in the artistry of it. And I was wondering, did you have control of that as well? And my second question was, if you could talk a little bit about the difference in process for you as an artist illustrating someone else's words, and because it seems to me a very different process. And then I would like to vote that you please write a book with boats.
Thank you. No, we had a lot of fun with the fonts in this book, and there's a company called Walden Fonts, and they have a Civil War font set and a Western font set, and we just bought those and played with it. And you know, I think when you are the author and illustrator, you do have sort of a great deal of authority over the book. And the editor on this book, Dick Jackson, and the designer, Michael McCartney, and I, we have a very comfortable relationship. This is the third book we've worked on together. So we're really able to sort of talk about these things as a team and play with them. It was sort of fun. I don't think Michael would mind me saying this. Michael has a very clean sensibility. He has a very modern sensibility. And I kept just wanting to throw 19th century wood type at him. So, you know, there was the three of us sort of felt our way through doing that. But I had a lot of fun with it. So, thank you. Hi.
Did anybody inspire you to start drawing?
Did anybody inspire me? Well, I had a lot of support growing up from my parents, Ted and Kathy Floca of Temple, Texas. And a lot of great teachers, and you know, I think a lot of kids love to draw, and I was just one of those kids who kept drawing. So if you like to draw, keep drawing, kids. Thank you.
Thank you.
Get another kick.
Did you start drawing and were you good automatically, or did you keep on practicing?
I think when I was a kid, I was good enough to feel like I was good at it, without necessarily being good at it. I don't know. I was good enough to enjoy it.
And also, where do you plan on taking pictures next? Like drawing where?
Well, the next story that I'm illustrating is a story by Avi, who I've gotten to illustrate books before. And that's going to be a story about wolves in Colorado. So this spring, I got to go out and visit Avi in Colorado, where he lives. And I took a lot of pictures of the beautiful Rocky Mountains. So that's what's next for me. Thank you. Are you going to come grab me, or do I just walk off?
Pretty soon.
Okay.
Can you take one more?
One more? Yes, one more.
I'd like you to talk about your art school experience and what you felt was most valuable that you learned at art school that led you into becoming an author illustrator.
Thanks. Well, I went to a liberal arts undergraduate school. I went to Brown University, which was a great experience. Hey, Matt. And and that was a terrific experience. And I'm really glad I had that sort of broad liberal arts background. And then several years after college, I went back to art school for a master's program. And that was great, I think, because I had always been sort of the one of my friends who was most serious about drawing. And it was, which was fun, but it was really nice to spend intensive time with other people who were as serious as I was about drawing. And to have that sort of validated and to see their practices and compare them to mine, and to get to sort of bounce off their talents and interests. So I think that was a very useful and important thing for me. I don't think it's necessary for everyone, but it was necessary for me. Okay, and we have time for one more question.
Why did you choose to be a kids book illustrator instead of other choices you could have had?
That's a great question. The kinds of drawings that I have always liked to do are drawings that tell stories, sort of narrative drawings with characters in them. And when I was in college, I got to take a class with David Macaulay, who's a great author and illustrator, and sort of got to look at children's books with an adult eye and see that those were the kinds of pictures that were needed for children's books. And so children's books became sort of a place where I can make the kind of drawings that I had always most enjoyed making. And I loved reading as a kid, so that felt good too. And I think that is it. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.